So today we're going to be looking at this picture of Eilean Donan Castle in Scotland, and we're going to be painting a loose ink and watercolour sort of landscape, and I'm going to be trying to show you how I do that here in 4 steps. So it's important to mention here that this stage, which is effectively stage 1 of the art process here, is very, very rough. It's very kind of it's not wholly resolved, the line work. It's a little bit jiggly and a little bit loose because it's going to be refined as we get further down. So this stage is just laying out the bare bones. So you don't have to be too precious, you don't have to go into too much detail. It's sort of zoning in those areas and saying, well, here's a little bit of hill, here's a little bit of castle, here's vaguely where the arches of the bridge go and things like that. And what that enables you to do is to start step 2, which is kind of in some ways the funniest of all the stages, I think. And that is the initial watercolour wash. So here I'm using my wonderful Meaden ceramic palette, which is an absolute beast. It weighs about 2 tons, and I do like it. And I do think it makes me feel slightly like a surgeon in a weird way. Something very sterile and clean and satisfying about a freshly cleaned ceramic palette. So as you can see here, I've wet the page. I haven't let it soak in for a long time. And if you look at the reference image, we have this kind of vignette of blue. So I'm adding that in. I'm really not being sophisticated at all with my painting style here. I'm being quite rough with it. And then one of the reasons why I like working this way is because, and also there, I'm putting in some clean water because I want to soften off that vignette a bit. So I'm adding in a little bit of clean water there, and it's just going to create a little bit of softness in the middle there. So the next stage is to start adding in a little bit of the more softer colours that are going to be in the background. So we've got these hills. So this is something that you apply first to create a sort of foundation, then you build more and more upon that as you go. Now there's also a little bit of pink in the sky, a little bit of red. So what I'm doing here is I'm sort of replicating that, and then I'm adding in what I think is like a mirror of it in the water, and that's going to help us with this idea of we have a horizon, and that sort of creates a mirror, if you know what I mean. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, but as long as it's vaguely right, because obviously water moves, so as you have waves, it's going to distort that mirror. So with some of my watercolours, I really like to be realistic with the tones and create something that feels not photorealistic by any means, but it feels sympathetic to the scene. But often the other thing I quite like to do is just to pick out some bright colours and add them in, and not be afraid to add in some colour pops. And I think also there is this element that as it dries, it's inevitably going to lose some of its punch. So what I've done is I've just diluted a little bit of that colour there into a slightly softer tone with a bit of water. And I'm using that a little bit further back to create some softer shapes of like hills behind. Now a lot of this is very loose, and you could argue very much a taste thing really. But I do think there's a level of serendipity with this kind of technique that always is fun. You're never going to know 100% what you're going to get, and that is a lot of the joy of it. So here I'm using a darker tone, and I'm just adding in a little bit of structure on that headland on the left hand side there. So I'm trying to show that there's a couple of elements, some bits are closer to us than others. I'm jumping about a bit here, and I'm all over the place. So I'm putting in some dark for the kind of rocks, and also some dark for those elements there. So I'm starting to paint in the bridge a little bit here. I'm also very much aware of, I'm starting to paint in the bridge and a few of the sort of shadowy areas of the building here. I'm also quite hyper aware that, when this is dry, it's going to be a lot lighter. But what I'm doing is just looking at colour blocks. I'm looking at what areas, squint your eyes and look at that reference image and see what areas are dark and what areas are light. Now, there's no reason why you can't ultimately go back in and add in a lot more detail as you go. So don't feel you have to do too much at this stage. And also, if you think, God, that just looks too dark, you can always pull a little bit out with tissue paper. So what I'll do is I'll often just get carried away and just put too much in, but then quickly suck that back out with tissue. So there we can see how that looks now after it's been hair dried. You can see a lot of the middle bit of the paper where it was a lot wetter. The reflection has gone a lot softer. Now there's certain elements here I really love. I mean, I think some of the bits around the castle are really nice. I think on the right hand side we've got some of those reds are a bit dominating, but I mean it doesn't matter because we're going to be building up the contrast a lot more in the rest of the image now. So we've done our first layer of watercolour, so this effectively is stage 3 now, and this is our second layer of watercolour. So what we're going to be doing in this one is we're going to be going in and we're going to be adding in a lot more detail, a lot more shadows, and we're just going to be trying to tell the story a little bit better. So we've got shadows on this gable end here, and we've also got a reflection of those shadows in the water. Now if I was doing this a lot more accurately, I'd probably be using a lot smaller brush for those reflections and trying to get it to look a bit more diffuse and random, but it's quite a speedy sketch, this one. I think in total it was about 45 minutes from start to finish for the actual whole drawing, so there's not a lot of concise work gone into this. You know, it's actually quite nice and loose and quite quick. So as you can see here, I'm adding in some more details on the water, some gable end, and then I'm adding in the arches under the bridge, which make quite a nice difference actually. They really do create a little bit more obvious texture there. And then adding in a little bit more reflection on the right hand side. So what I've decided to do, again, as I mentioned before, is re-wet and then with a paper towel pull off a little bit of the pigment. And that's going to create a slightly softer image, which I think is a bit more effective really. So finally, I'm adding in a little bit more of this brown in the reflections, because I don't want the reflections to be just the sort of shadows. I want it to be more encompassing of the whole castle there. And the final phase is the final bit of line work. Now here I'm using this brush pen. Now this is a sepia uni pin, but it's thicker. It's got a lot more chunky character to the line work, and there's quite a lot of contrast in this scene. There's quite a lot of lights and darks, and it's not a shy piece. So I think the line work can be quite bold, because I think it kind of complements it really. So as I said in the description, this is loose ink and watercolour landscape drawing. This is not photorealistic. This isn't, wholly accurate. It's a lovely loose sketch that you could have done sitting on the side of the lock. So I'm trying to be a little bit loose with it. I'm trying to be a bit free. And not fussy about counting windows and, adding in loads of detail, but yeah, it's a fun one. So I'm adding in a little bit of detail there of some of the walls, and trying to pick out some of the areas that are in real dark shadow on the right hand side of the castle there. It's funny when you do these, what I would roughly call line and wash type drawings, whether you do the line work first or you do the line work second and the painting first. It's always interesting when it coalesces. There's a stage towards the end of the drawing where you start seeing the monster you've created, and it kind of all starts to gel together, or sometimes not, but at the end of the day, the whole point of doing any of this art is because the journey's more fun than the destination. So because I've left that quite dark line just above the bridge there, which I think is actually a bit distracting looking back at this now, I would say I could re-wet that area just above where I am now and pull out a lot of that pigment, because I think it's a little bit distracting. That it could do with being a bit softer, and I want the bridge to pop a bit more there, because that's our foreground. But I'm kind of fighting it a little bit by adding in some thicker lines in the foreground here, and that helps us kind of get a feel for that bridge being closer to the viewer. I mean, the other thing that's interesting there is I've got some big bits of white under the bridge, which I'm hopefully will resolve, but we'll see, maybe not. So what do you think about this technique? I mean, what do you think about the image? Do you think it works? It's quite a subtle scene in a way, and what I'm doing here is quite big and bold. Do you like it? Let us know in the comments. So I said final touches, but there's final touches and final touches, and here I'm doing my final touches with a slightly I think this is a 0.5 fine liner, not a brush one. This is the 0.5. So a few little finishing touches there on that stonework, just to sort of suggest some detail. And then there's a tiny bit of painting that I've spotted I haven't done here, and I want to add that in, so we're going to put in just a little bit of roof details there. I think that will help tie everything together with a bit of reflection and a few dots here and there. So I think that's worked really well. I think there's a lot of interesting bits there. If we go over to the far left hand side, we can see how that land sort of softly disappears. Sort of vignettes worked. I mean, I could have gone a lot darker there. There's some quite rough and ready mark making in the far right hand side on the sky, and this shadow down the front right hand side here is a bit rough and ready, but again, I don't mind that really. If we have a look at the buildings and just sort of scroll across those, I think they're really fun. Some of the reflections got quite a lot of life to it. The one thing that I personally probably don't like as much as the rest of it is just to the right of the castle. We've got this very dark red line here, and I think the whole of that land needs to be slightly less crazy, because it does tend to draw the eye a lot. But anyway, it matters not a jot. Yeah, it was really good fun. I really enjoyed that. It's a symphony of brown. So I hope you enjoyed that, guys. There's a little fun YouTube for you, as ever. Check out my Patreon. There's also membership of this channel here. Thanks for stopping by. We'll see you again. Bye-bye.